In the crowded toy store on Christmas Eve, CEO Andrea Whitlock reached for the last limited edition doll on the shelf, but at the exact same moment, single father George Linton's hand closed around it too. They tugged, argued, surrounded by crying children and flashing lights. But when Andrea accidentally glimpsed the little girl standing behind George, eyes wide, filled with hope, she froze. Suddenly, the toy wasn't meant for her anymore. It had to belong to that child. Could one toy really change the fate of 3 people? Andrea Whitlock was 33 years old, with wavy blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold. She wore a striking red V-neck dress that commanded attention in every room she entered. Her beauty was the cold kind, the kind that made people step back rather than lean in. As CEO of Whitlock Toys, she'd built an empire manufacturing the very doll now clutched between 2 pairs of determined hands. But success had cost her everything soft. Her past held a dream of motherhood that infertility had stolen. Her ex-husband had left because she worked too many hours, loved her company too much, needed control over every detail of her life. Her personality reflected her history hard, distant, almost impossible to reach. She bought this toy for herself, a strange attempt to heal the little girl inside her who'd grown up without affection, without anyone noticing she existed. George Linton stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that came from years of lifting boxes and loading trucks. At 35, his face showed exhaustion in every line, but kindness lived in his eyes. His thick winter coat had seen better years, patched at the elbows, faded at the collar. He worked as a delivery driver, the kind of job that paid bills but never quite caught up to them. His wife had died when their daughter Helen was only 2 years old. He'd become both father and mother, learning to braid hair and pack lunches and stay up late with fevers. He lived carefully, spending nothing on himself, saving every spare dollar for Helen's future. This Christmas, she'd asked for only one thing: the Stella Star limited edition doll. He'd promised her, and George Linton kept his promises, even when keeping them meant fighting a woman who probably earned more in a day than he did in a month. Helen Linton was 7 years old with light brown curls that bounced when she laughed, which was often. Her pale skin flushed pink in the cold, and her smile could melt the hardest heart. She understood more than most children her age. She never asked for much, never complained about their small apartment or second-hand clothes. She believed in magic still, believed that Santa listened to good children, believed her father when he said everything would be okay. Tonight, she believed she'd finally hold that beautiful doll she'd seen in the store window every day on the way to school. Supporting them were others who'd become part of this story. Clinton Ward served as Andrea's assistant, a quiet man who witnessed his boss's loneliness and wondered if anyone else saw it too. Rosalind Myers lived next door to George and Helen, secretly making sure they had enough groceries, slipping envelopes of cash under their door, and pretending the landlord had made a mistake on the rent. Flynn Harrington was the investor who smelled blood in the water, ready to destroy Andrea's company and build his fortune on its ruins. And Bonnie Field worked the register at this very toy store, watching the drama unfold with wide eyes and wondering who'd walk away with the last doll. The first conflict erupted in aisle 7, beneath bright fluorescent lights and dangling paper snowflakes. Andrea's fingers touched the box first, she was certain of that. But George's hand had closed around it at the exact same instant, his grip firm and unyielding. Their eyes met over the colorful packaging that promised joy and childhood magic. Andrea's voice came out sharp, edged with authority. "I believe I reached it first, and considering I'm the one who created this product, I think I have priority." George's response was calm but immovable as stone. "With respect, ma'am, I'm the father who promised his daughter. That's a different kind of priority." The commotion drew attention. Other shoppers stopped to watch. A mother with twin boys whispered to her husband, A teenager pulled out his phone, then thought better of it when Andrea's cold stare found him. Bonnie Field stepped closer from her register, unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness. Employees appeared from the back room, and someone recognized Andrea immediately. They sided with their CEO, naturally, but the customers had different sympathies. They saw George's worn coat and tired eyes, saw the little girl behind him trying to make herself invisible, saw a father fighting for his child's Christmas morning. Helen stood 3 feet back, her small hands clasped in front of her, her hopeful expression crumbling by degrees. She'd heard her father's promise. She'd believed in it the way children believe in stars and wishes and the goodness of the world. Now she watched that promise slip away, held in the manicured hands of a stranger in an expensive red dress. Andrea noticed her. The moment stretched long and strange. Something in Helen's face triggered a memory. Andrea had spent decades trying to bury herself at 7 years old, standing alone at a school event while other children were picked up by laughing parents. Herself waiting by the window on Christmas morning for gifts that never came. Herself learning too young that some children mattered and others didn't. Her grip on the box wavered. But pride held her hand steady. She'd built a company from nothing. She'd survived divorce and disappointment and the hollow ache of wanting children she'd never bear. This toy was hers. She'd designed it from her own childhood dreams. Every curve of the doll's face, every detail of its dress, came from the little girl she'd once been. That secret weighed heavy tonight. Nobody knew the Stella Star doll was Andrea's attempt to create the friend she'd never had, the beautiful companion who would have made her childhood bearable. The prototype sat locked in a vault at company headquarters, the very first doll, the one she'd painted by hand and dressed with fabric scraps. It was priceless to her, irreplaceable, and seeing another child reach for its mass-produced copy felt like watching someone else claim her memories. But George didn't know that. He only knew his daughter's wish, his own promise, and the few dollars he'd scraped together by working double shifts and skipping meals. Crisis approached from multiple directions, though only Andrea felt its full weight that evening. At Whitlock Toys headquarters, a technical malfunction had contaminated an entire shipment. 5,000 dolls were being recalled, destroying the company's reputation and Christmas profits simultaneously. Flynn Harrington had been circling like a vulture, making calls to board members, planting doubts, positioning himself to swoop in and buy the company at bankruptcy prices. Andrea's phone had been buzzing all evening. She'd ignored it, driven to this store by some desperate need to hold the thing she'd created, to remember why she'd started this company at all. But the crisis wouldn't wait. Flynn wouldn't wait. And now this stubborn delivery driver wouldn't wait either. In the midst of their standoff, a child near the front of the store knocked over a display model of the Stella Star doll. It hit the floor hard, and a mechanical arm popped loose. The store manager rushed over, flustered and apologetic, trying to reattach the piece. George stepped away from Andrea for just a moment. His hands moved with unexpected precision, realigning the joint, testing the mechanism, snapping it back into place with a confidence that came from somewhere other than delivery driving. Andrea watched, startled. "You have engineering experience." George's jaw tightened. He handed the repaired doll to the manager without answering. But Andrea had seen enough. Those weren't the hands of someone who just lifted boxes. Those were the hands of someone who understood how things worked, how to build them, how to fix what others broke. She didn't push for an explanation. But her mind filed the information away, adding complexity to the man she'd dismissed as just another struggling father. They returned to their stalemate over the doll. Bonnie Field finally intervened, her voice nervous but kind. "Maybe we could call other stores, see if anyone has stock left?" Both Andrea and George knew the answer. This was Christmas Eve. Every Stella Star doll in the city had sold out weeks ago. This display model and the one they fought over were the only ones left. Helen's breathing changed. George noticed immediately the slight wheeze, the flush creeping up her neck. He touched her forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin. Panic flashed across his face, the kind of terror only parents know when their child's health is at stake. Andrea saw his expression change. She'd been studying him, trying to understand what made a man so determined to win a toy that cost more than he probably earned in a week. Now she understood. His daughter wasn't just his world. She was his entire universe. Helen stumbled. George caught her, and the doll fell from his hand as he focused on keeping her upright. She was burning up, her eyes glazed, her small body trembling. For the first time that night, Andrea's carefully maintained coldness cracked. She remembered being sick as a child, lying in bed for 2 days before her nanny noticed. She remembered the loneliness of fevered nights with nobody to check on her, nobody to bring water or change her sweat-soaked sheets. She pulled out her phone without thinking and called Clinton Ward. Her voice came out clipped and efficient, but underneath it was something that might have been compassion. "I need an ambulance at Riverside Toys. Now. And make sure it's the best crew available." George looked up at her, shock and confusion and desperate gratitude warring in his expression. "I can't afford." "I didn't ask about your finances," Andrea cut him off. "Your daughter is ill. Let someone help you." The next minutes blurred. Paramedics arrived, efficient and kind. They checked Helen's temperature 103 degrees and determined she needed monitoring but wasn't in immediate danger. George held his daughter close, whispering reassurances, stroking her hair with shaking hands. Andrea stood apart, watching. Something inside her shifted, like a locked door easing open after years of rust. She didn't understand it yet, but she felt it. Internal conflict tore at Andrea through the following days, relentless and unfamiliar. She kept seeing Helen's face, kept hearing George's steady voice promising his daughter that everything would be okay, even when he had no idea how he'd keep that promise. She'd built her entire life around control and power and the cold satisfaction of being right, of winning, of never showing weakness. But she'd never felt as small as she did standing in that toy store, watching a poor man be richer than her in every way that mattered, every way that counted when you stripped away bank accounts and business cards and impressive titles. She thought about her ex-husband's final words before he walked out of their marriage. "You love your company more than you could ever love a person, maybe more than you're capable of loving anything real." She denied it then, had thrown a crystal vase at the door after he left, had told herself he was weak and jealous and incapable of understanding what it took to build something from nothing. But maybe he'd been right. Maybe she'd poured everything into Whitlock Toys, into designing products that made other children happy, while the child inside her stayed frozen and afraid and utterly alone. George's face haunted her too. Not because he was handsome, though he was in a worn, honest way, but because he looked at his daughter with such pure, uncomplicated love. Andrea had never been looked at like that. She'd never looked at anyone like that. Her relationships had been transactions, partnerships, arrangements of convenience. Love, real love, was something she understood intellectually but had never actually felt. For the first time in years, she wondered what she was protecting, what she was fighting for. Whether winning battles and building empires mattered at all if you ended up alone with your victories. George wrestled with his own guilt. He'd been harsh to a woman who'd helped them without being asked. Andrea Whitlock had every reason to be arrogant and cold. She'd earned her success, built her company, deserved respect, and he'd treated her like an obstacle, an enemy, someone to defeat rather than understand. But gratitude sat uneasily in his chest. He'd spent Helen's whole life protecting her from people who had too much, who thought their money bought them the right to everything. He'd promised himself they'd never owe anything to the wealthy, never be beholden to anyone who could hold their debt over them. Yet Andrea had helped without asking for anything in return. She'd called the ambulance. She'd stayed until the paramedics cleared Helen. She'd even told the store manager to hold the doll, though George couldn't afford it now, having spent the money on Helen's fever medicine and the copay for the emergency clinic visit. Slowly, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not friendship, but a mutual recognition that they'd both been wrong about each other, that maybe people contained more complexity than first impressions suggested. Christmas approached with relentless speed, and George made a decision. Helen had recovered from her fever, but her disappointment about the doll had settled into quiet acceptance. She'd stopped talking about it, stopped mentioning Christmas morning, stopped asking if Santa had received her letter. That silence broke George's heart worse than any tantrum could have. He put on his thickest coat and went searching, store to store, mall to mall, crossing the city in the weak winter sunlight. Every shop gave him the same answer: sold out, no stock, nothing, until next year. One manager laughed when he asked, told him he should have planned better. Should have bought earlier, like responsible parents did. George kept walking. His fingers went numb, his boots soaked through. But he didn't stop. The snowstorm rolled in near evening, heavy and sudden, the kind that made the news tell people to stay home. George was 15 blocks from his apartment when the first flakes started falling. Within 20 minutes, the world turned white and wild. He pushed forward, head down against the wind, following street signs he could barely read. His phone battery had died hours ago. He didn't know what time it was, only that Helen would be worried, that Rosalind Myers would have heard her crying and would be sitting with her now, making hot chocolate and telling her stories. His legs gave out near a familiar building, tall glass and steel, elegant even in the storm. The headquarters of Whitlock Toys. George laughed at the irony, a bitter sound swallowed by wind. Of course he'd end up here. Of course his desperate search would bring him to the doorstep of the woman who'd started all this. Andrea saw him through the window of her office. She'd been working late, avoiding going home to an empty penthouse, pretending the company crisis could be solved by sheer force of will and enough coffee. Movement below caught her eye, and she recognized George immediately, the shape of him, the determined slump of his shoulders. She was downstairs in 30 seconds, pushing through the lobby doors into the brutal cold. "What are you doing? Are you insane?" George looked up, snowflakes caught in his hair and eyelashes. He started to speak, but his teeth chattered too hard. Andrea made a decision faster than thought, grabbing his arm and pulling him inside. The building's heat felt like a furnace after the storm. George stood dripping on marble floors, looking lost and embarrassed. Andrea called Clinton Ward again, sent him to George's apartment to get Helen and Rosalind, to bring them here where it was warm and safe. Helen arrived, bundled in blankets, her eyes wide with wonder at the enormous building. Rosalind came too, hovering protectively, ready to scoop both father and daughter away if this rich woman turned out to be dangerous. But Andrea was gentle. She showed them to a conference room with soft couches, brought hot chocolate and sandwiches, gave George dry clothes from the company gym. Helen fell asleep against her father's chest, her fever long gone, but her small body exhausted from worry. Andrea watched them. The image seared itself into her memory. A father and daughter, poor and tired and absolutely complete. This was what family looked like. Not the cold formality of her childhood dinners, not the strategic networking of her marriage. This was love, simple and entire. She made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She left the conference room and took an elevator to the executive floor. Her private vault was there, the place where she kept prototypes and contracts and the things too valuable to trust to anyone else. Inside, wrapped in cloth and locked in glass, sat the original Stella Star doll, the one she'd made with her own hands 17 years ago when she'd first started the company. The one she'd never mass-produced, because it was too personal, too much a piece of her soul. Andrea unlocked the case. Her hands trembled as she lifted the doll, feeling its familiar weight, seeing her younger self reflected in its painted eyes. This was her childhood friend, her imaginary daughter, her healing made physical. She carried it back to the conference room. The truth came out in whispers, appropriate for the late hour and sleeping child. George woke when Andrea entered, alert immediately in the way parents learned to be. He saw what she carried and started to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. Andrea sat across from them, holding the doll in her lap like a real child. She told George about her childhood, about the parents who'd been too busy for her, about the loneliness that had shaped every decision she'd ever made. She explained that Whitlock Toys had started as therapy, an attempt to create for other children the joy she'd been denied. The Stella Star doll was her masterpiece and her confession. It represented the little girl she'd been, the friend she'd wished for, the daughter she'd never have. Making thousands of copies and selling them had felt like sharing her healing with the world. But keeping the original locked away had been necessary too, a reminder that some pain was private, some losses irreplaceable. George listened without interrupting. His expression shifted from suspicion to surprise to a deep, aching understanding. He saw her now, not the cold CEO, not the woman who'd fought him over a toy, but a wounded person trying to survive her own history. "I was jealous," Andrea admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of children whose parents loved them, of people who understood family instinctively, who didn't have to learn it from books and therapy and trial and error. When I saw Helen looking at that doll, wanting it so badly, I saw myself, and part of me wanted to keep it from her, to prove that childhood wishes don't come true, that wanting something doesn't mean you get it." She looked at the doll in her hands. "But that's not the person I want to be." George's throat worked. He understood loss and sacrifice. He understood loving someone so much it hurt, and he understood that sometimes the bravest thing was letting go. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Helen will be okay. She's strong. She'll understand." "I know she will," Andrea replied. "But I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm doing it because I want to. Because maybe healing isn't about holding on to everything that hurt you. Maybe it's about giving it away." The crisis exploded 2 days before Christmas. Flynn Harrington made his move, calling an emergency board meeting, presenting evidence of the product recall and tanking sales figures. He had a buyout offer ready, papers drawn up, pressure applied to every board member who owed him favors or feared his influence. Andrea fought back with every weapon she had: data, projections, reminders of the company's long-term value. But Flynn had been planning this for months. He'd positioned his pieces carefully. The board wavered, and Andrea felt her life's work slipping away. Helen overheard part of the confrontation. She'd been at headquarters with George, who'd come to return Andrea's kindness by fixing a series of mechanical issues with the production line. The little girl wandered into a hallway at the wrong moment and heard Flynn's cruel voice through an office door. That doll was always worthless, just like the woman who made it. Helen burst into tears, not for herself, but for Andrea, for the way adults could be so mean, for the unfairness of someone attacking a person who'd been kind to her. George found his daughter crying and learned what she'd heard. Something fierce and protective rose in him, not just for Helen, but for Andrea too. This woman who'd helped them, who'd shared her painful history, who'd shown them gentleness hidden beneath layers of ice. He studied the production reports Andrea had shown him days earlier. His engineering mind engaged fully for the first time in 7 years, since before his wife died, since before survival replaced passion. He saw the problem clearly. The technical failure wasn't in Whitlock's production line at all. It was in a component supplied by one of Flynn's subsidiary companies. George spent 12 hours reverse engineering the failure point, documenting the sabotage, building an irrefutable case. Flynn hadn't just waited for an opportunity. He'd created one, deliberately supplying faulty parts to tank the company's reputation and force a sale. When George presented his findings to Andrea, she stared at him in disbelief. "You found this? You figured this out?" "I used to be a lead engineer," George admitted. Before my wife died and I had to find work with flexible hours so I could take care of Helen. I gave up that career, but I never stopped knowing how things worked." Andrea felt the earth shift under her feet. This man, this delivery driver she'd dismissed as simple, as ordinary, had just saved her company, had used skills he'd sacrificed for love, had stepped up without being asked, had protected her the way he protected his daughter. The revelation changed everything. Flynn Harrington's scheme unraveled spectacularly. Andrea presented George's evidence to the board, who immediately launched an investigation. Flynn tried to bluster and deny, but the documentation was thorough and damning. Within 48 hours, he was removed from all company dealings, facing lawsuits, his reputation destroyed. Andrea kept Whitlock toys, but the victory felt hollow until she looked across her office and saw George, and remembered why she'd fought it all. George's past came into full focus through conversations that stretched late into winter nights. He'd been a prodigy once, designing child-friendly robotics for an educational startup. He'd had patents and awards and a future that looked limitless. But when his wife died from complications during a routine surgery, he'd fallen apart. The startup couldn't wait for him to grieve, so they moved on. He'd needed flexible hours and emotional space, so he'd taken the delivery job. It paid enough. It let him be present for Helen. That was all that mattered. Andrea understood sacrifice differently now. She'd always thought she'd given up everything for her company, but George had given up everything for his daughter, and he didn't regret it for a second. That was the difference between them. She'd built an empire to fill a void. He'd abandoned his empire to fill a need. But she also understood potential. George's mind was brilliant. She'd seen it in action, watched him solve problems her team of engineers had struggled with for weeks. He was wasted, loading trucks and delivering packages. The bigger revelation hit her quietly, without fanfare. She'd spent her life chasing success and control, believing they'd make her happy. But happiness wasn't something you built or bought. It was something you received, something that came from being seen and accepted and valued for who you were beneath the accomplishments. George saw her. Helen saw her. They'd looked past the cold exterior and expensive clothes and impressive title, and they'd found someone worth knowing. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and fresh snow. Andrea had cleared her schedule, sent Clinton Ward home early, locked her office door. She walked through the quiet building, carrying the original Stella Star doll wrapped in silver paper. George and Helen were waiting in the conference room where they'd first found shelter. It had become their space somehow, this room where three unlikely people had learned to see each other clearly. Andrea knelt in front of Helen, eye level with the little girl who'd changed her life. She held out the gift without ceremony, without explanation. Helen unwrapped it carefully, and her gasp when she saw the doll was pure magic. "It's her. It's really her." "Santa heard me." George started to speak, his eyes bright with unshed tears. But Andrea shook her head. Let Helen believe in magic a little longer. Let Christmas be what it was supposed to be. "Thank you," George managed finally. The words carried weight, gratitude, not just for the gift, but for everything. For the ambulance, for the shelter from the storm, for seeing him as more than his current circumstances, for trusting him with her company's crisis. Andrea cleared her throat, suddenly nervous. "I have something else." Someone who understands product design and manufacturing. someone who can prevent future sabotage, someone brilliant enough to innovate but practical enough to make it work. George's smile was sad, touched with old grief and older resignation. I can't. Helen needs me. I can't go back to 60-hour weeks and business travel and missing her childhood for conference calls and deadlines. I gave that up for a reason. Part-time, Andrea interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. 20 hours a week. Flexible schedule. Work from home when possible. Full benefits, including the kind of health care Helen deserves. A salary that reflects your actual value and expertise, not your availability or current job title. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I think Helen would be incredibly proud of her father. I think you've sacrificed more than enough, more than anyone should have to. And I think you deserve to be the person you were always meant to be, without losing the father you've become. Helen looked up at her father with shining eyes. Daddy, you used to build robots? That's so cool. George laughed, and it was the sound of something breaking open, some hard shell he'd worn for 7 years finally cracking. Yeah, kiddo, I did. You should do it again, Helen said, with the certainty only children possess. You'd be really good at it. They ate dinner together that night, not a fancy meal. Just pizza and salad at the conference room table, with cheap decorations Andrea had bought from the drugstore on the corner. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't what CEO Christmas Eves were supposed to look like. But, for the first time in her adult life, Andrea felt like she was home. 1 year later, the changes were impossible to miss. Helen had become the face of Whitlock's new line of toys, a collaboration between Andrea's design, vision, and George's engineering genius. The campaign, featuring a real child, not an adult's idea of childhood, had revolutionized the company's brand and tripled profits. George had bought a modest house in a safe neighborhood with good schools. He worked 3 days a week at Whitlock headquarters and 2 days from home. He coached Helen's soccer team and attended her school plays and made dinner every night. He was a father first, an engineer second, and he'd never been happier. Andrea visited often. Too often, according to Clinton Ward, who'd developed a knowing smile whenever his boss left early on Thursday afternoons. The second Christmas found them gathered around a tree in George and Helen's living room. Andrea brought gifts, thoughtful ones, not expensive ones. For Helen, a robotics kit George had designed. For George, a framed photograph of Helen laughing. And Helen had a gift too, wrapped carefully in newspaper and ribbon. Inside was a small box, and inside that was the original Stella Star doll. I want you to have her, Helen said seriously, because you made her when you were sad. But I think maybe you're not as sad now, and she should stay with her real mom. Andrea's vision blurred. She pulled Helen into a hug, this child who understood so much, who'd seen through her defenses and found someone worth loving underneath. George watched them, his expression soft and unguarded. The distance between them had disappeared gradually, class differences and money and past hurts fading as they learned who they actually were beneath those labels. He wasn't a poor delivery driver. She wasn't a cold CEO. They were just people, trying to build something real. Helen stepped back and smiled at both of them. You know what? You two look like a family. Did anyone ever tell you that? Andrea and George locked eyes, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Not love yet, maybe. But the beginning of it. The recognition that some people were worth building a life around, that some connections mattered more than anything you could manufacture or design. Before the Christmas tree, with its lights reflecting off glass ornaments and the Stella Star doll sitting in a place of honor on the mantel, the three of them stood together. Not perfectly aligned, not traditional in any sense, but real, authentic, whole. Andrea spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she'd learned this year. You know what? I think this is the family I've been looking for all along." Helen grabbed both their hands. George met Andrea's eyes again, and his smile held promise and possibility and patience. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, they were warm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Andrea Whitlock wasn't fighting anymore. She'd finally found something worth surrendering to the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of belonging.